I'm Ethan Russo, a neurologist and CEO and founder of CReDO Science. Welcome to Professionally Cannabis.
Where do they go, the smoke rings I blow each night?
For today's pod, it is an absolute honor to be joined by none other than Dr. Ethan Russo, undoubtedly one of the pioneers of cannabis and someone whose research underpins a lot of the industry's understanding of both the plant and the endocannabinoid system. With a glittering CV, including the likes of GW Pharmaceuticals, Ethan now is the founder and CEO of CReDO Science. He is a total legend and someone we cannot wait to speak with. So, Ethan, welcome to the Professionally Cannabis podcast.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you.
We're very glad to have you here, and we'd like to start off by asking what led you to the plant?
Well, it was quite a journey. I was trained in traditional pharmacology in medical school and as a neurologist. And after about 7 years in practice in Missoula, Montana, I hit a bit of a rut emotionally in that I felt that I was giving increasingly toxic drugs to my patients with less and less benefit. And this led me back to a interest from my youth in medicinal plants. I was particularly interested in doing research on plants for migraine. On the area in the world where there seemed to be the most plants that were used that way was the Amazon jungle. So I decided I'd take some Spanish classes at night once a week for a year and a half, and eventually found myself 2 trips to the Amazon in Peru, culminating in a 2-month sojourn with the Machigenga tribe in Parque Nacional del Manu, a very unacculturated group of indigenous people who had hundreds of medicinal plants that they derived from the rainforest. So we found a great many treatments for migraine, also psychoactives. And at that point, I knew I wanted to, as much as I could, transition my career into medicinal plant research. When I got back to the States, by that time it was 1996, and there were quite a few developments going on, particularly Proposition 215 in California, which legalized medicinal use of cannabis and served as a catalyst for similar developments in many other states and countries. So I quickly became embroiled in what we'll call the cannabis controversy, and tried to do research on cannabis for migraine, which had been a traditional treatment for 1,000 years, above all in the UK and somewhat in Europe and in North America for the century prior to its prohibition. To make a long story short, I applied through the regular channels through the federal government in the US, but eventually was stonewalled and unable to gain a source of supply for the material. But in the meantime, I had studied intensively cannabis in the endocannabinoid system, was learning a great deal, and became enthralled with the discipline for its varied aspects. It's a very deep subject when you're looking at the growth of the plant, the production of its biochemicals, how it interacts with the human body. It was just endless in its variety, and has remained of interest for the 25 years since. But in the course of this, I did publish an article on cannabis and migraine in the journal called Pain in 1998, which caught the attention of Jeffrey Guy, who was the founder and chairman of GW Pharmaceuticals, and by this time in 1998 had achieved the ability to develop a cannabis-based drug with the backing of the British Home Office. So that began a long-term relationship, first as a scientific advisor, and then in 2003, I came on full-time as senior medical advisor and was involved in the development programs for Sativex and Epidiolex.
And at this point in your career, how does it feel to now be a business owner? And what have you learned from the decades of working with notable other companies that you've been able to apply to your new journey with CReDO Science?
Well, how it feels is simultaneously exhilarating and scary. It's been rough out there. We chose to begin this company at a point where investment in the cannabis space was at a low. at its nadir, which was followed directly by COVID-19. So it wasn't a great time to start a company, but we've managed to make good progress this past year via our own devices and self-funding.
Surely that you are not someone who has trouble being funded in this environment. I mean, I would say that most everyone who's been funded has probably had a deck which considered reaching out to ask if you'd be a board member on. That seems ridiculous to me.
Well, that's the truth of things. We are a private company. Most of the interest is in publicly traded companies, and that's just not a step I'd like to take at this time. For better or worse, after having been in the field for 25 years and being a bit superannuated myself, we'd like to do it our way at this point and continue to have control over the direction of things.
And who came up with the name, Ethan? Oscar is very much the Latin buff between the two of us on the podcast, so I'm sure we both showed appreciation for it.
Yeah, well, great. Nobody's asked me that. It originally started out as an acronym for cannabisresearch.org, and that sort of creates the acronym of CReDO. But I had 4 years of Latin, and I know that it means I believe. So we have a catchphrase of the proof is out there, sort of a takeoff of the X-Files motto. And that was it. A lot of these things come to me at odd times. It might be 3 a.m. when I'm lying awake thinking instead of getting back to sleep, or I do a lot of my best thinking in water, whether it be the shower or swimming. So people get their inspiration in different ways.
Well, as a fellow participant in a company with a Latin name, mine being Uvo, I aid. I stand right behind you on the importance of bringing the classics into these ventures. But let's talk about those ventures, because I don't want to perhaps draw you out of anywhere that's commercially sensitive, but I'd imagine a lot of people would see someone of your stature and experience starting a cannabis company and think, oh goodness, he's going to be doing something particularly complicated, maybe a combination of cannabinoids, minor cannabinoids and terpenes in a product, maybe some sort of clinical studies. Can you shed any light on where you're intending to head? I imagine it's probably still early doors.
Sure, but we've made good progress. We're what my partner, Nisha Whiteley, likes to call an intellectual property holding company. At this point, we have 6 provisional patents and 1 full patent. That one's been in the hopper 2 weeks, and it runs the gamut of different areas. We have 2 diagnostics related to the endocannabinoid system. One is for what has been considered a rare condition, but certainly appearing more. On that one, we have recently gotten great results that we believe are going to lead to a commercial test, hopefully later this year. And we're looking to publish that shortly. I'm in the midst of drafting the article. And then we have a second diagnostic for a very common condition, which to this point in time doesn't have an established pathophysiology. That's medicalese for what causes this disorder, which has been somewhat enigmatic to this point. That one's really conjectural, but if we are right about this, it would have very important implications for this common condition, both in terms of having an available diagnostic test where one has not been present before. So we're excited about that. Our recruitment is underway. We're about halfway there and hope to have that done and the lab part completed, say, April, May of this year.
I was going to ask about the diagnostic tools that you're looking into, just to make explicit. Are these systems that would check within somebody's endocannabinoid system and say, oh, perhaps this needs to be modulated in this way, or which seems to me very new, or is it something else that I've perhaps misunderstood?
No, that would be accurate. But the endocannabinoid system, for those that aren't familiar, is the main homeostatic regulator or physiology. To break that down, it's what keeps our systems of how we work in balance. So necessarily it impacts on many other systems, both biochemical and physiologic. Everything ends up related in the end.
To what extent and to what degree would you say that trying to focus slightly away from sort of THC, which is, underpins a lot of what cannabis researchers and operators are doing at the moment. To what extent would you say that trying to tap into other avenues is impacted by, well, your previous experience of working predominantly not for US based companies and understanding the hurdles that federal illegalities have? Is that an influence, or is this just where you see the most cutting edge science?
Well, it's actually both. Obviously, as you've gathered, over the course of the last 25 years, I am American, but I've spent the majority of that time working for foreign companies. Now, there's nothing wrong with that, but it is a reflection of the continued vestiges of prohibition and its inhibition of research, which remains very much in a similar situation to the way it was a generation ago. It hasn't changed that much. Maybe this is the year, but every year one hopes for better, and every year one has more gray hair or less hair. So it's a problem. The other way of looking at it is a little bit different, and that is the plant makes upwards of 150 different phytocannabinoids, plant-based cannabinoids. We know the pharmacology basically, or a lot of about 10 or 12 of these. And each of these has unique therapeutic properties which haven't been properly exploited, although that's a pejorative sounding word. So I think similar developments can accrue to some of the so-called minor cannabinoids, which have a great deal to offer that hasn't really been properly investigated or developed to this point.
And on the topic of minor cannabinoids, is there anything you can share with our listeners that may be sort of novel or out there for them? I'm also bearing in mind that I know on the website of CReDO, you've talked a little bit about your perhaps transition from the fairly open and communist world of scientific research to the more closed commercial developments of building your own business and patents and so on. So I trust you will give us just a taste of what you're looking at here when it comes to minor cannabinoids, perhaps rather than the full pie.
Okay, well, sure. Let's do a tasty tidbit. I think one of the next big things is cannabidiol. So in one way of looking at it, this is the mother of all cannabinoids because it is a precursor to the others. This is a very interesting compound therapeutically. It may not be very familiar to your listeners, but for example, in the Pacific Northwest of the US where I live, this has actually become a popular item that's been available to some consumers. To this point, there wasn't a lot of information about human use, but with colleagues at Washington State University, we recently did a survey, a very detailed survey of use of cannabidiol predominant products by consumers to see what they ascertained about it. Among other things, it seems to be an excellent treatment for anxiety, but without the kinds of side effects that one might attribute to standard anti-anxiety drugs. Anti-anxiety without sedation, without a lot of the side effects that people attribute to THC. A lot of people in the survey found that these CBG preparations were as good or better than conventional medicines, and many reduced the use of the latter. So we hope to publish that information and spur on additional research in this area. We're trying to promote the availability of plants that are rich in cannabidiol, that this and other applications could be applied. So that's just a taste of one example.
Delicious.
But we could have similar stories about many of the other minor cannabinoids.
And I'm assuming that at CReDO, you're not cultivating your own plants, but if you've got this need for very specific chemovars or phytonutrients, how does your sourcing process work?
Well, it's a hybrid, if you will. Yeah, you're right. We're not growing plant cells, but we're relationships with different companies around the world to produce these and in turn produce products from them. But again, this is a situation that's inhibited by existing laws that we hope will be changing in the near term.
And talking of those laws, and we've touched upon them before, it's clear that there are several roadblocks in cannabis research and commerce. Some of these alleviated with the Farm Bill, but really the federal illegality piece stands firmly in the way of huge strides being taken forward. Something I'd be keen to ask you as a pioneer in this space is, has there ever been any sort of sliding doors moments in the past where it perhaps looked like there were some insurmountable hurdles that may have gotten in the way of some of your research that did turn out to be sort of pioneering in the space?
Well, I'm afraid, again, the situation in the States hasn't materially changed in the last 25 years. There have been incremental changes, certainly on the state level and the availability of material, but it still is not possible in the United States to develop a medicine from cannabis from a domestic source. This explains why I worked for foreign companies all that time. What's ironic is Sativex and/or Epidiolex were imported into the US and used in 100 different clinical trial sites. But the same thing would be impossible today with a domestic source of cannabis. So that's a very strange situation, particularly for a company that's supposed to be the paragon of capitalism. Somehow they've ceded the ability to pursue this line of commerce to other countries.
Yeah, I think there's definitely questions about the political relationship GW had in order to get that home office license when no one else was developing. But I think it raises an interesting point in that modern America would still, federally at least, make it very difficult for such research to take place. I think there's the research center in Mississippi and maybe one other place that can do it.
It is possible that the new attorney general could deschedule cannabis, but in all likelihood, this needs to be in a congressional move. We've been disappointed many times before. I'm old enough to remember that cannabis was almost legalized in the US in the 1970s, and then things went south, so to speak, very quickly. And then we were left with just say no in the Reagan era. And it's been a long haul back out of the hole, so to speak.
So you're very much of a position of not counting chickens before they're hatched. I see.
I
That makes
cannot. This is why we have such a diverse portfolio, and I'm not adverse to working with people in different countries around the world to achieve our aims. If it can't be done here, perhaps it can be done elsewhere, and we will continue those attempts.
And speaking of diversifying industries, this is cannabis adjacent, so if it's not relevant, we can skip it and move on quickly. But something that often comes up in the professional world of cannabis is the rising world of psychedelics. And I'm just thinking back to your opening answer and your experiences in Peru. I feel that this must be a world that also is of interest to you. Are you making any movements in this space?
Well, it's absolutely of interest to me. I'm trying to confine myself to one Schedule 1 forbidden drug at a time. But no, among the Machigenga, they had many psychedelic type plants that they used. I actually got into this whole thing through that sphere of influence rather than cannabis per se. It remains of great interest to me. We would entertain the possibility of doing some consulting work, but I wouldn't be trying to develop that type of drug myself at this point. To sort of transition back to cannabis, I think people really make a mistake in thinking that one echelon of the business can eliminate the others. What I mean is we have cannabis in three forms as medicine. Pharmaceuticals, which have to follow an intense development program and have consistent, safe, effective formulations is proven by regulatory bodies. That's the highest echelon. Next, we have the supplements that hopefully have some measure of quality control, but can't make the same kinds of claims therapeutically. And also we have the artisanal or herbal forms of cannabis. Again, it's always a recycling argument about which is the way to go. I think that all three need additional development. None can eliminate the others, much as they would like. So one of the things that we're doing at CReDO is we're offering a formulation service, both to the pharmaceutical industry and to the supplement industry, again, to try and make cannabis safer and better. My contention is that a lot of the negative results we've seen in cannabis-based studies are merely due to inadequate material. Very few studies have really been done with truly optimized material that have made full use of cannabis components to produce the best therapeutic result with the fewest side effects. And so this is always my aim. in thinking about future studies is what can we use that's going to do the best job.
And as we draw closer to the back end of our conversation, probably have time for a couple more questions. I have something that I'd be quite keen to pick your brain on, and that is for listeners of ours who are business owners within the cannabis space and are interested in some of your IP or interested in the services and the research that you guys are putting together at CReDO. Well, I guess sort of flipping it on the head, I'm sure there are hundreds of businesses that are interested in working with you, but what do you look for in a collaborative partner? What are the key qualities of the people and the organization that sort of will get the green light and thumbs up from your side?
Well, all of this requires money, but that isn't the aim of anything we're doing. It really isn't. What we are trying to do is get better medicine, better and safer medicine in the hands of the people. If that leads to revenue, ultimately, that's great because we would use that to further research. We'd like to be in a position in a few years where we are helping other companies with good ideas develop their programs and funding their research, because certainly the government has fallen short in this regard. National Institutes of Health in this country has traditionally been the biggest funder of biomedical research in the world, but their budgets have been gutted over time. There are other priorities. So it's fallen to private companies to pick up the slack. But if I can pick on Canada for a moment, there's some 260 licensed producers of cannabis in Canada. Very few have done any clinical research, and usually it's been in the form of observations, such that they would give their products to some number of patients and ask them how they did. Well, that doesn't quite cut it in the world of scientific proof, or certainly for regulatory bodies like the Food and Drug Administration or the EMA in Europe, or Health Canada in Canada for that matter. We need a higher standard of proof. We know how to do this. We can help other companies to do it, but we prefer companies that share our philosophy about what this is really about. It's about patients and improved health. If the money follows, that's great, but I'm not doing this for financial reasons. I could have been like my colleagues and retired to the golf course some 15 years ago, but that had no allure for this guy.
Well, I think someone who was a founding member of GW, especially with the news that's come out recently, probably works for the love of it rather than the need, assuming that there were a few shares kept behind. So that's very true.
No such luck.
No such luck. Oh, that is the cruelty of this commercialized world. Well, anyway, we won't get into that. I think we've probably got time for one more question before we wrap it up. And something I wanted to ask that I think all our viewers will like, and this is about the supplementation side of things. Just based on the pre-conversation we had before recording, I know that you are, of course, interested and invested in your own health. And I wonder if you could talk a bit about the supplementation process you go for and whether you include perhaps cannabinoids in that, and what sort of things work for you or you look for in making those conscious, enlightened decisions.
Well, I think people would be surprised how little cannabinoid exposure I have myself. There are different approaches to improving endocannabinoid tone. Some of them certainly can involve cannabis, but there are a lot of lifestyle approaches that perhaps can obviate that need and are a good place to start. Specifically, dietary use of prebiotics and probiotics. What I believe is developing theory is that the gut-brain axis works with bacteria in our gut that may be the things that really regulate the endocannabinoid system. So between diet and aerobic activity, I think that we can see improvement in many human conditions that play into the endocannabinoid system. If that's not enough, certainly there are many ways of leveraging cannabis-based medicines to pick up the slack and try and attack a wide variety of human ailments.
Well, I think that sort of brings us back to our classical beginnings of the conversation, where the spirited nature of people back in ancient Greek times was referred to their thumos, but that was their gut. And so perhaps that ancient received wisdom of the gut having some part of the emotion is becoming truer and truer and borne out in the research. I know you're very busy, so I just want to say thank you so much for joining us here on Professionally Cannabis. You've been a star guest, and we feel blessed to have had you on.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you for the opportunity.
Please take me above, take me with you.